this segment, I want to continue discussing the presidency and the Constitution. In this section, I want to look at the more modern limits on the presidency. Now, starting out with a discussion of the limits on the presidency may seem odd, except that in this modern age, when the presidency has become such a powerful institution in American government, it's important to see what limits there might be on presidential power. We discussed already the origin of the presidential power and the initial limit, impeachment, placed on the presidency. Today, now we're going to consider two other limits that are in the Constitution that limit the president in one way or another. There were no additions to the Constitution from 1789 until 1950, a long period of time without any need to limit the presidency. But in 1950, in the late 1940s and early 1950s, the political system, people in the political system decided that an additional limit on the presidency was necessary. The cause of it was the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt, in which Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected president 4 times, the only president in history to be elected 4 times, and, as nearly as we can tell, the only president who ever will be elected as many as 4 times. Prior to Franklin Roosevelt, the custom in America was to say that a president would serve 2 terms and then step aside, following the example of George Washington, who did exactly that when he could have had a 3rd term or a 4th term, or could indeed have been declared president for life, if he'd wanted to, because of his success as the general leading the American forces in the Revolutionary War. The custom worked, but it was always just a custom, and there were times when people thought maybe a 3rd term was appropriate. Ulysses S. Grant thought about a 3rd term. He was not very popular, so a 3rd term turned out not to be very real. Theodore Roosevelt sought what amounted to a 3rd term in 1912, and he got a lot of votes for president. He came in 2nd in the popular vote, but not enough to win a 3rd term. His cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, did succeed in getting a 3rd term in 1940 and a 4th term in 1944. And in both cases, Roosevelt succeeded, partly because he faced, the United States was facing the possibility of war in Europe, or, in 1944, the actual conduct of war in World War II. So some extra justification for Roosevelt holding the office longer went forward. But it was not satisfactory to many people. Many people in the Republican Party and in the conservative southern wing of the Democratic Party thought that Roosevelt succeeded not because of foreign affairs, but because his domestic programs had been popular. It may seem strange that someone would think that because a program was popular, that would mean the president should be eliminated. But in the conception of these conservatives, by offering programs that gave aid to people, Roosevelt was buying votes. And they didn't want to have somebody buying votes and then staying in office forever and ever and ever. So they decided that the custom of the 2-term limit on the presidency should be made a constitutional mandate, and they pushed it through. Now, they made arguments having to do with the president's health, because it turns out that Roosevelt didn't actually serve 4 terms. He served 3 terms and a month, and then died. And the assumption was that he was ill before the election, probably correct, that he was ill before the election, and had the people known how ill he was, they might not have elected him. But nonetheless, that was their argument. It wasn't very realistic. And, in fact, if you look from a policy standpoint, the 22nd Amendment doesn't look very good. The 22nd Amendment says that no person can be elected president more than twice, or serve, or elected more than once, if he served more than 2 years of a term in which someone else was elected. That's a very close paraphrase of what the 22nd Amendment says. Now, the problem with the amendment from a policy standpoint is that not everybody is equally affected by the stress of the office. Some, like James K. Polk, were finished after 1 term. The only president who had fulfilled all of his promises, and he did, by working harder than most of his predecessors and many of his successors. But he worked himself so hard that he died within a month of leaving office, or a very short time after leaving office. Others have obviously served 2 terms in office and then lived 20 or 30 years after they left the presidency. So it's hard to say that it's merely a question of health, that 2 terms is inevitably destructive of a president's health. That's the bad part. There are other problems with the 22nd Amendment. The 22nd Amendment, in effect, ties the hands of the voters. It says the voters who might wish to continue someone in office for 3 terms are precluded from doing so. They don't get a chance. If you wanted to have Ronald Reagan for 3 terms, sorry, couldn't have it. If you wanted Bill Clinton for 3 terms, sorry, you couldn't have him. If you wanted George W. Bush for 3 terms, sorry, you couldn't have him. And if you want Barack Obama for a 3rd term, you can forget about it, or at least as far as I can tell, you can forget about it, because I don't see any move to repeal the 22nd Amendment anytime soon. So, it is a curious amendment with a doubtful rationale in the first place, and then secondly, the impact of limiting presidential power, eliminating the popular choice of president. Now, as for presidential power, there's another problem. The 22nd Amendment, in effect, unties the hands of a bad president for the 2nd term. Because the theory of elections is that one will serve in office, and by serving in office, one will do a good job in hope of being reelected. And one will avoid doing a bad job because of the threat that you might be defeated. Both of these incentives are gone under the 22nd Amendment during the 2nd term. So if there's a bad president who wishes to do bad things, he's pretty much his hands are untied in the 2nd term, unless they are so bad that they force an impeachment. The second issue is, what does it do to presidential power? Well, it turns out to have a bad effect on presidential power during the 2nd term, because the 2-term limit on the president makes the president a lame duck in his 2nd term of office. He's a lame duck because what has been taken away from him is his power to reward people who stand with him, and his power to punish people with the withdrawal of presidential favors if they don't follow his policies. So a president has lost a lot of his strength, and it's observable. In virtually every case of a president in his 2nd term, there is a period of time that grows as the 2nd term goes on, in which the president becomes a lame duck, in which he's unable to push his policy through, in which all of the scandals come forward. The Iran-Contra scandal, big part of Ronald Reagan's 2nd term. The Lewinsky scandal, big part of the 2nd term of Bill Clinton. The collapse of support for the Iraq War, a big part of the problem with George W. Bush. And while we can't say for certain what the issues are that will affect Obama between the 2014 election and the end of his term in 2017, the kind of discussion that's in the press today suggests that he's not going to get off any easier than his predecessors did. The 22nd Amendment is a problem, but I will note this: the 22nd Amendment is carefully worded. It is a well-written amendment. It's just not good from a policy standpoint. The last item that represents a limit on presidential power is the 25th Amendment. It's a different kind of amendment. It really does address the issue of a president's health. The first thing it does is it says that if a president dies or resigns or is impeached, that the vice president will become president. This is an important thing. Actually, the wording of the original Constitution didn't quite say that the vice president would become president on the death of the president. It only said he would be acting as the president. Now, precedent of the very first case in which a vice president was elevated to the presidency suggested otherwise. But the wording of the Constitution needed to be clarified, and the 25th Amendment did that. It did that in part so it could make another statement on who would act as president in certain circumstances. The second principle of the 25th, the second provision of the 25th Amendment is a provision that calls for a vice president to be named in the event there's a vacancy in the vice presidency. Vacancies in the vice presidency are created when there's a vacancy in the presidency and the vice president is elevated, but they also occur independently if a vice president dies or resigns in office. 4 vice presidents have died in the last 200 years, and 1 vice president, Spiro T. Agnew, resigned because he was pleading guilty or pleading no contest to felony charges that were leveled against him. The other provisions of the 25th Amendment are very important and will have to be the subject of another discussion of the presidency and the Constitution that will be our next segment.